Okay, so in this lesson, we're going to be talking about how to find domain and range, right? So our objective is going to be find domain and range of the functions using proper notation. So pay close attention to that because the notation is very important and you will be graded on that in this class, okay? So let's look at the basic definition. Domain is a set of all inputs. So all the x values, right? This is review because you guys just did this with Miss Yamasaki in the last video. And then range is the set of all outputs, right? So all the possible y values. So they could give you a table of values, right? Or actually, they could give you ordered pairs, and then you're asked to give the domain and range. Okay, so here is a bunch of ordered pairs, and what we're going to be using is the set notation. Okay, so this is very important. You want to write this down. What is a set notation? Well, set notation, you got to write these little brackets or braces outside, right? It's just saying this is a set of all the values. Okay, in here you list all the values and then you close that with the closing brace. Okay, so I'm going to do the domain using the set notation. So of course I'm going to have my braces and then all the inputs. So my domain, look, I have the braces on the outside and all my inputs, which would be my x's, right? So 0, 2, and -1. You might want to put them in order. It doesn't really matter to me. Okay, so here's the range. Again, in set notation, I need my braces on the outside and I list all my outputs, which are my y values. So -1, 7, and -5. Now let's try to do that when they give you table of values. Okay, so here, when you're given a table of values, like so, we're going to use the same set notation again to find the domain and range. So domain, in braces, of course, would be my x values, 0, 2, and 3. Here, I put them in order, but I don't think that's very necessary. And for the range is -1 and 5. I don't need to list the 5 again because 5 and 5, they're the same element. Okay, so my range includes -1 and 5, just 5 one time. Now let's do that when they give you a graph. Okay, so here is a graph. And we're going to do the set notation again for the domain and range. So let's look at the first point here. I'm going to look at the blue point, and that is -1 and 2. So so my domain has -1 and my range has 2. That's the first value. I have 3 other points though, right? So here's purple, which is 2, -2. So my input is now going to have 2, and my output is going to have -2. All right, let's do the orange. I have 3, -1. So my domain, my input is going to be 3. My range is going to have -1. And the last point, you guys probably can do this now, is going to be 4, 0. So my domain is going to have 4. My range is going to have 0. And I close the braces. So that's my domain and that's my range. It's, again, guys, it's just saying my inputs are these numbers and my outputs are these numbers. So I'm going to do a few examples with when you're given the graph, okay? Because you're going to have to deal with that a lot. So here are some graphs, and then we're going to do domain and range for them. All right, so here is a graph of a function that goes from here to here. It's just a little bar or a line here. All right, so we're going to do set notation first. All right, so I'm going to look at all the points here. And let's see, the first point here, okay, it starts at -3 and 2, right? That's -3 and 2. And it ends at -1 and 2. And so if I'm going to go in and list all the values of my input, I'm going to have like -3, -2.9, -2.8, and so on and so forth. And there are so many of them, right? So I can't list them all. So a way to deal with that is we're going to write like a whole like an inequality that represent from -3 all the way to -1, including all the values in between them. And the way we write that, okay, for the domain, we can write that as x, because domain is talking about all the input, so all the x values. So I'm saying my x values, okay, my input is between -3 and -1. So it's everything in between, because it says it's larger than -3 or equal to -3 and then less than -1, right? So that's everything in here between there. Okay, so notice that I put the equal here also because there's a solid dot, right? I include the endpoint. Same thing over here, it includes the endpoint. I put an equal sign here. And then the range is just going to be 2 for all these points, right? The y is just 2. All these points, the y is 2, so I just put 2 for my range. Now, I want to introduce you guys to what is called the interval notation. So you want to write this down. What is the interval notation? So interval notation is when you put it inside either parentheses or the square brackets. And I'll tell you guys what that means in a bit. But all you do is you write the starting point and the ending point. So it's really good to use when you have like a range of things, right? Something that goes continuously instead of just point and point and point, single point. Something that goes continuously, you want to use interval notation because that's pretty easy. So let's see what the domain looks like. Remember, I start at -3, I go to -1, right? So starting point, ending point. So left to right. So my domain is -3, -1. Now, why is that I put parentheses up here, but here I use square brackets? The difference is if it includes the endpoint, you use the square brackets. If it doesn't, you use the parentheses. Okay, that might be hard to remember. You might want to write that down. Rewind this video, but I'm going to repeat for you. If it includes the endpoint, you use the square brackets. If it does not include the endpoint, like if there's an open hole here, then I use parentheses. Okay, let's do the range. The range, remember, it's only at 2. So it starts at 2, it ends at 2. So here it is. I write square brackets 2, comma 2. It goes from 2 to 2. Basically, it doesn't go anywhere. It's just one single point at 2. Example number 2. Here is a graph. Ooh, here's an open and here's a closed. Okay, let's do set notation for the range first, domain first, right? Let's look at the domain. I'm going to show you a way to think about domain. Okay, when you think about domain, you want to think about all the x values that it includes right here. Like, what are the x values? So what you want to think about, you want to imagine that your graph, you want to look toward the x-axis when you're doing domain. Look toward the x-axis, like that, right? So I'm looking toward the x-axis. So one more time, like that. So I'm looking toward the x-axis. If I'm under, I'm going up. If I'm on top, I'm going down. Look, now what are my x values? Well, it's going to be here, right? So it's going to be along this little red line here I have for you guys here. So it goes from -2 all the way up to 3. Okay. And does it include -2? No, because there's an open dot here. Does it include 3? Yes, because there's a closed dot here. Okay, so my domain in set notation, remember the braces, right? So my domain is going to be -2 and it goes up to 3, and my x is larger than -2. I don't have an equal sign here because it's an open dot. And then over here I have 3 and it's equal to because it's a closed dot. Now guys, you only need to learn one of the notations. So either set notation or interval notation. I don't recommend trying to learn both. For the test, you only need to do one of them. It's just good to see both of them because a different book might use a different type of notation. So you might want to know both, but learning how to use exactly both of them for the test, it might be confusing. It might be too much. Right? So just look at them, know both of them, but really nail down one of them. Okay? Really know how to use one of them. So in interval notation for the domain, remember, I start from the left, I go to the right. I start at -2, I go to 3. So here it is. I put parentheses because it does not include the endpoint. I put square bracket because it includes the 3. So I go from -2 to 3. I do not include the -2. Okay, let's do the range. So same way to think about range, except now if it's range, you go toward the y-axis, right? Like this. There you go. One more time, you go toward the y-axis. All right. So what is my range? Well, it's all along here, right? So range, you go from the bottom to the top, right? Just lower to higher. Just like domain, you go left to right. Range, you go bottom to top. So I start at -1 and I go all the way to 3. So in set notation, I write it like this. I use y instead of x because range is talking about the output, so the y value. So I start at -1, I go up to the -3, and I don't have an equal sign here because there's a hole here, right? I don't go all the way up to -1. I end right there. So there's no equal, but there's an equal here for 3 because there's a solid dot here. Okay. Interval notation for range is -1 to 3, again, parentheses, and square bracket. Okay, so here's another example. Let's start with the domain. And again, domain, I want you guys to think about going toward the x-axis from your function, right? From your graph here, go toward the x-axis, right? Mentally think about, if you go toward the x-axis, what x values will you touch? Like so. All right, so I'm touching all of these values, and so my domain is like that. Now, why do I draw this, my domain go all the way toward the left like this here, like this, teetering bar here? So it goes all the way toward this way because there's an arrow on this graph here. That means this goes on forever, and that means I'm going to touch all the x values over here, right? So my domain, I'm going to write x is anything less than 3. Okay, I don't have a starting. Well, my starting point is everything all the way to the left. It's so small that I don't need to say it starts anywhere. I'm just going to say anything less than 3 is part of my domain. Okay, because it goes toward the left of 3. And I don't have an equal sign because it's an open hole here. Okay, in interval notation, if you want to use interval notation, you have a starting point and ending point. If you go all the way to the left forever, what is your starting point? All the way to the left. So you can start at -infinity. That means it's never ending, right? -infinity up to 3. And then that's it. Okay, let's do the range. So the range is do the same thing, go toward the y-axis though. So mentally draw these images in your head. You're going toward the y-axis. So where are you touching the y-axis? So it's just here, and there's a break in between, and it's from here down, right? So my range, I'm going to write that in set notation. I want to do this part and do this part, right? But I'm going to start from the bottom up, right? So here, I'm going to say y is less than 1 because here's 1, right? Anything lower than y, lower is less than, so y is anything less than 1. And I'm going to put a comma so I can add in this part. Y is between 2 and 3. Notice there's an equal sign because there's a solid dot. No equal sign here because there's an open dot here, so no equal sign here. For interval notation, you do it also in 2 parts. First part is this, so it's going to be -infinity up to 1, and I'm going to put this u here. This is a symbol called the union symbol. It just means and, this and that, okay? And then I'm going to start at 2 and go up to 3. And square bracket because it includes 2, and parentheses because it's open. It does not include 3. Example 4, we're almost done, guys. Please just go through these. Don't stop the video now. Just watch it through so you know all the types, okay? So here is another function. Let's look at domain. Domain is just going toward the x-axis, right? So I just have that going here, and I have this going here. So there's no thickness to it. It's just a line. So my domain is actually at -2 and 1. And those are just values. There's no range in there. Okay, so my domain is just -2 and 3. And in set notation, I mean in interval notation, I have to do -2 to -2 because it's a single point at -2, and then union, that means and then 1 to 1. Just a single point at -2 and 1. When I do range, I have to do that. And I look, oh, where is my where's my range, right? So where is it touching the y-axis? See, it goes on forever. It goes on forever. That's why my red part here goes on forever like that. So for my range, I can just put all real numbers, right? That means that every number is included because there's an arrow on both sides. It goes up and down. And for the interval notation, I can put -infinity all the way to infinity. That means everything. Last one. So last example, let's look at domain. You think about going toward the x-axis like so. And so where's my domain, right? My domain goes on all the way. I put an arrow here all the way toward the right because there's an arrow on my function. And my function keeps going this way. This way, it doesn't. It stops here because there's a dot. It stops there, right? So my domain is going to be starting at -2 all the way to the right. So I put x is anything larger or equal to -2. Okay, toward the right means anything larger. So for my interval notation, I start at -2 and I go up to infinity. Remember, infinity, you can never get there, so you put a parentheses. But here you include this endpoint, so you put a square bracket. Range is the same thing. You go toward the y-axis, though, like that. Right? But then it keeps going forever this way, right? So it actually, my red part should keep going up forever. So for that, my range goes up forever that way because of that arrow. Right? So here, my range is anything for y is anything larger than -1 because it starts at -1. Okay, and then for interval notation, I put from -1 up to infinity.